is in keeping, as you no doubt sense, with the whole effort to describe a technical system to this type of work, this empathic work. And I don't mean it to be taken too literally, because of course empathy can be, as we indicated before, indicated in a great many ways, for example, by your bodily postures or by your affective attunement. Right? But it seems to me useful to try to describe also the grammars of the schools. And by way of introduction to that, let me say that if you try to lay out other features of the schools, you naturally think of such things as the objectives of the different schools. And there, of course, we've commented, as you knew already anyway, on the fact that the objective descriptive people are seeking a set of symptoms and signs which they draw forward into a syndrome and then hopefully into a disease state, etc., etc. And we know something about what the analytic objectives are in terms of the discovery of the infantile neurosis and then, of course, its appearance in the transference neurosis. We know we can say something about the objectives of social psychiatry and their preoccupation with the environmental envelope of mental life and the designation of the social field. In existential psychiatry, in turn, the goal, of course, is to be with the other, the discovery of the other through empathy, the discovery of the other's existence through one's own existence in the world of the other. All that, those phrases are probably known to you. However, we can also specify a geography of the school, as some of you've heard me say. That is, each of the schools has a way of orienting the therapist vis-a-vis the patient. That is, in the traditional medical objective descriptive stance, the therapist or the doctor imposes between himself or herself and the patient some kind of instrument, what I call instruments of objectification, in keeping with the objective descriptive school. That is, a desk may be placed between the patient and the doctor. And the purpose of the desk, of course, is not only to provide some kind of professional statement, but also it preserves an objectivity by highlighting the position of the doctor. It allows the doctor's equipment to be at hand, and all those various equipments themselves are sometimes imposed between. For example, there may be instruments of multiplication, things that allow you to see better. You may impose between yourself and the patient some kind of desk pad or stenographic device by which you can be more objective, be more sure that you have secured accurately whatever the materials are that the patient is producing. All those instruments of objectification specify the relationship between the patient and the physician. You could also mention the white coats or the uniforms which are characteristic of medical practice, which again highlight the particular role of the physician in relationship to the patient. The geography of psychoanalysis is equally well known, and it's been a source of endless merriment, of course. The fact that for the first time in the history of medicine, the doctor made it his point to disappear. I shouldn't say the first time, because of course in Chinese medicine it's said that sometimes the examination is conducted behind a screen and the patient holds up a puppet and points out the areas of pain. In that sense, they don't see each other either. But that kind of modesty has passed away, I understand, even from Chinese medicine. Anyway, in the psychoanalytic geography, you have this surprising spectacle of the physician going out of sight, the therapist or analyst going out of sight. And this, of course, had the best possible justification in that the search was not for the illness in the person of the patient or an LSN, because in fact the analyst couldn't even see the patient for the most part. That is, in Freud's couch in particular, which was a very high, humped couch, it was impossible to see the patient for the most part, and then indeed the patient is not looked at in that setting. So that not only does not the patient, the analyst in analysis disappears not only so that he can't be seen, but also so the patient can't be seen. Because it isn't the purpose is not to see, is it? The purpose is to hear. The purpose is to collect the free associative material of analysis. And Freud knew very well that if you concentrate on seeing, it'll probably diminish the accuracy of your hearing, because the central nervous system can't do too many things at once. So that there were other reasons, of course, for the unusual geography of analysis. The most highly documented, of course, is the flat position in which the effort to simulate a hypnagogic, or even hypnotic state, or sleeping state. And this was very much in keeping with the notion that the fundamental rule of analysis, which was to say whatever came to mind, would be accentuated. The possibilities of success in that would be very markedly accentuated if you were in a state of mind in which you were dreamy or sleepy. That is, the active censoring properties of mind would be in that situation diminished. And so again, the patient was put flat. And other features of analytic geography concern the frequency of visits. The room is often very silent and very quiet. In a very complex and sophisticated developments of analysis, analysts would pride themselves, for example, on using silent pens, so that if they took notes, which Freud himself had suggested they should not take, but if they were to take notes, the pens would be silent, so the patient could not hear the sound of the scratching. Maybe Freud couldn't hear either, since Freud had suggested that the analyst should not take notes during the process. So maybe it was a double victory in these ball-bearing pens or whatever they are. And then, of course, the idea was that the relationship with the analyst was to be accentuated in this hypnagogic state, perhaps by pretending that there were no other patients. And as you know, sometimes in the refinements of the geography of analysis, separate entrances and exits were provided so that when one patient went out, they didn't go out through the waiting room. And that's a practice that's very widely adopted in the analytic community. Again, because one wants to preserve this kind of cave-like hypnotic atmosphere of a single relationship, an exclusive relationship, in which it was hoped that the material of the deepest levels of mind might be more likely to surface on the person of the waiting analyst. And as I say, this particular procedure has been a source of endless cartoons and other forms of merriment, but it has a very elaborate and interesting justification and represents the first major addition to our systematic geographies that mark out the fact that Freud had discovered something technically different. And as Binswanger said about Freud, he had for the first time provided both the technique and the ideas by which the materials that passed between human beings, things like sexuality, aggressivity, distortions, for the first time, those might be taken up into some kind of scientific understanding. And that indeed seems to be the case, too. The geography of interpersonal work has by no means been as highly developed as either the geography of objective descriptive work or psychoanalysis, but the first hint I had about its nature came when I read a long time ago that sometimes Sullivan placed himself beside the patient or at an angle of the patient so that they were not looking at each other, nor was the therapist out of sight, but they were to some extent side by side. And that, of course, had the obvious justification that in this social psychiatry, then by being side by side, the two would be looking out to where the pathology was thought to lie, i.e. in the relationship to society or in society itself. So that one can say almost absolutely that a feature of the geography of each school is that they allow the practitioner to place himself in such a position as to see where the trouble is. So that therefore the physician stares at the patient who presumably contains the illness. The analyst places him behind the patient so to catch the materials as they well up, as in the kind of balloons over cartoon characters. To collect that verbal material and then the social psychiatrist looks out on the world in which pathology is thought to originate in the social psychiatric point of view. Of course, it had also the advantage that that by not being stared at, the two people perhaps reduced the amount of projections each placed on the other, because here was a technique which aimed not to increase the transference phenomena, but in fact to decrease the transference phenomena, instead to try to find out what the sources of the transference phenomena were in social life. Furthermore, it was implicit in this technique, this non-staring, this being beside, a form of alliance, wasn't it? What Tom Guton and I call a situational alliance, i.e. you are together with the person as you look at the problem. And so you are not only on the side of the patient, or not only beside the patient, but you're on the side of the patient in the additional sense of being a companion or advocate of the patient's problems. So that it's easy to justify, to rationalize, if you like, this side-by-side geography of interpersonal method. Tom and I called it a situational alliance because it reminded us of a very similar phenomenon that springs up naturally when people, for example, strangers, will meet watching a fire or a parade, and you will find yourself often speaking comfortably with people you don't know well as your attentions are directed elsewhere, while the self-consciousness that perhaps arises more spontaneously in face-to-face encounters is avoided. I reflected on this in part because I think I mentioned to some of you that when I was in college, at Williams College, in those days used to hitchhike, perhaps more than people feel safe doing now. And I remember sometimes at night in a truck with a truck driver, someone with whom my intellectual arrogant superiority would never ordinarily permit myself to be found, right? And Ivy League snob, would find myself talking with considerable animation and disinhibition with someone I would ordinarily, quote, not talk to. And in fact, there were one or two things I remember talking to with one truck driver that I didn't get to in my analysis even. And, although I don't know whether that's whether that is the ultra point, but anyway, it was certainly the striking disinhibition that took place as the two of us stared through, perhaps the windshield wipers, out into the field of the world that was gradually the dark fields of the Republic rolling on in front of us through the night. And I'm sure many of you have had similar experiences. Now, finally, to get to the geography of existential work, this too has been a source of merriment, by no means as hilarious as that which accompanied the analytic satires, but for example, in one of the early efforts to get close to the patient, which obviously is the objective in phenomenological and existential work, i.e. to indeed merge with the patient, to live under the skin of the other. Obviously, one of the earliest efforts simply was taken, as is true of early efforts in perhaps all fields, taken up concretely. And so in order to get close to the person, everybody removed their clothing, as was characteristic in warmer climates and where psychotherapeutic efforts were made, for example, in the Esalen, certain phases of the Esalen experiments. But people thought they might get closer to each other if they didn't have clothing between them. Curious kind of concretistic thinking, but a very common kind of concretism. I reminded you once before, I'm sure, if you didn't know already, that Freud made the same kind of mistake himself when he thought he could press the conflictual thoughts out of patients' heads literally by means of pushing on people's foreheads. And then there was the experiment that Minkowski inadvertently made when he went to live with the patient, thinking that if he were to live in the same room, sleep in the next bed, day and night for 6 months or 3 months in one case, that he might therefore enter the world of the other. In this case, entering the world meant, of course, not the psychological world necessarily of the other, but the literal, actual, day-to-day physical world of the other. And that experiment, which, like so many early psychiatric experiments, was not really an experiment at all, in the sense that it was not planned. It was actually done because Minkowski was broke, and a rather rich man who was also crazy needed to have some kind of attendant, essentially, and hired, therefore, this Polish physician. In any case, in the course of that, he did find out about a great deal about the patient, of course, and did learn something about his world. But what he really learned was not the world of the patient, but the world of the patient as inhabited by Minkowski. And this same thing, of course, was true in the development of social psychiatry, where the initial efforts of social workers to enter into the world of the others consisted of Adolf Meyer's wife going and visiting patients in their homes. Well, this was not an invasive kind of visit, was it? That Mrs. Meyer would knock, and she would climb up the stairs, and by the time she got there, they'd put away the weird relatives and the various instruments of assault that they'd previously been throwing at one another, and she got quite a cleaned up picture. And it was many years before the great Adelaide Johnson at the Mayo Clinic was able to demonstrate absolutely conclusively that the stories that you get from families by means of asking the relatives under those circumstances have very little connection with what actually is going on in the household. But in fact, in order for Adelaide Johnson to demonstrate that, she had to essentially Watergate a whole series of families by means of getting people to squeal on each other, by getting in the postman and the milkman, by finding out that so-and-so really knew the secret, and that if you could beat him down over 3 or 4 months, he'd tell you, and then if you told that to the mother, she'd have to admit it, and the father would then squeal on somebody else, and you eventually do what the district attorneys do when they try to find out what actually happened. Not the fantasy world, but the actual world. What Sullivan called what you would have seen if you'd been there. But the methodology of the Mayo Clinic studies is so elaborate and so time-consuming, and the results are so horrible and awful, and point to such a disorganization and homicidal quality of family life that no one has ever bothered to repeat them. And one day, one of you will gain your everlasting fame, I hope, by repeating, maybe not with the 26 families, but with 4 or 5 families, and demonstrating that the relationship between the social work history as told to us by the family and the clinic procedures and the real facts went on is, if anything, negative. It's a negative correlation. And out of which I do the conclusion that there's something I call the social unconscious. That is, that the institutions are as protected as the lower compartments of Freud's mental model of the mind. So, but when in the course of the development of existential work, the concretistic attempts were gradually overcome and put behind, although they've never been put behind by everybody, but when they were gradually put behind, and the idea was reached people, that the purpose was not to be in the same room with the patient, but the idea was to be in the same mental space as the patient. Then we moved from a physical to a psychological method of interviewing, and we developed the idea of empathy. And in my way of looking at this, there have been 2 steps in the development of empathy. Binswanger made one, and if you can stand my saying this, I made the other. Binswanger suggested the fundamental rule of existential work. I like to use that word fundamental rule because each of the schools has a fundamental rule, doesn't it? The fundamental rule of analysis is say whatever comes to mind. The fundamental rule of medical studies is harder to formulate, but has something to do with observation, history taking. The fundamental rule of social psychiatry is to treat everything as it's a fiction until it's proved a fact. Maybe as we go on in these talks, if you and I survive together, that we'll try to develop that particular fundamental rule, because it's one of the most interesting of all the advices that you can offer. Treat everything as fiction until proved a fact. But the fundamental rule of existential work is what the Germans call the phenomenological reduction. That is, that in your working with the patient, remove from the clinical field everything that constitutes knowledge, prejudice, presupposition. Clear your mind, in other words, so that you come naked into the clinical encounter. Or as Binswanger said, put the world between brackets. You know it's there, you know there are things you know about people, but put them to one side and see if you can encounter the person afresh. Now I'm sure that you have some sense of of what the sort of philosophical background of that is, but let me remind you if it isn't foremost in your minds. See, this phenomenological existential quest springs from the notion that most human knowledge is really not knowledge of anything new. It's knowledge which you can call recognition. That is, it constitutes a form of knowing which is what you do in medicine, which is that you find a set or pattern of things that fit another pattern, and then you recognize that this is measles. And that's a great deal of what our learning is about. It's a form of recognition, or of pattern recognition, as is sometimes said. And you want to get to the point where a very small part of the pattern will trigger off all the overlapping patterns that suggests, and then you make differential diagnoses until you see what part of the patient's story fits most fully into the particular pattern that is measles or mumps or whatever it is that the person is suffering from. Now, there were those who said that if you used that method, and this question goes back to Socrates, if you use that question, all you can find out is things you already know. Because how could you discover something brand new if everything was to be fit into something you already knew? And that whole question of how the human being learns something new has preoccupied philosophers, as I say, at least since Socrates. And you remember Socrates said that you couldn't know anything new, that the only things you could know were the things you already knew. Because they would have to have some correspondence between the mind of the observer and the observed. Well, that problem was attacked by Heidegger and Husserl. And I don't mean to pretend any expertise or even more than the most amateurish connection with those obscure people, but my understanding is that the answer they came up with was that the way by which you could discover something new was the opposite of this system of recognizing, i.e. you had to clear your mind of the patterns which are meant to fit. Instead, have a kind of tabula rasa on which it might be possible that a fresh pattern could imprint itself. And the phenomenological reduction is essentially the effort to provide that kind of tabula rasa or blank receiving plate, so to speak, on which the new material might imprint itself. So that was the fundamental rule of existential work, and you can see what a very helpful contribution that is within limits. That is helpful in that if you allow yourself that freedom of mind, that openness of mind, as we say, it does help in your connections with people. I mean, it's most obvious when, for example, if you look at somebody and I look at you and I say, well, that's a man, or that's a woman, and that's a short man, or a tall man, or that's a hairy man, or a bald man. And when one makes all these, connects all these and collects all these different features, and you eventually can identify someone's membership in a class. Maybe they're black, or maybe they're yellow, or maybe you can make a kind of a role, you can provide them with a kind of a role, but the possibility of your discovering them if they were unique obviously increasingly disappears the more you, quote, classify. Now, it's also true, of course, that this can be a handicap, because in fact there are parts of us that do fit into all kinds of roles and patterns, and it's also very helpful to know that. And the physician who doesn't recognize that some people have cancer, who has a disdain for classifying people to the point where he ignores the classification cancer, is obviously no physician you want anywhere near you, right? So that I want to emphasize that when I talk about it, I'm not recommending one over another, but I'm simply attempting to add to our armamentarium of methods. I like to say that the disease school, the objective descriptive school, ignores the patient's personality in the search for disease, and the existential school is apt to ignore the patient's disease in the search for personality, right? And there's something to be said for both of those. There's something to be said against each of them, obviously, too. Well, so that the first rule, the first considerable light on the existential discovery of it was this phenomenological reduction. It has had a number of statements, a few of which I've already made to you, but let me remind you. One of the most beautiful, in my opinion, is the great Carl Rogers' account of empathic work, in which he compares with the physician or the therapist becoming a pane of glass through which the patient is seen. And I'm sure some of you wondered, as I used to wonder a long time ago, that how is it that in almost all Rogers' writings that I know much about, there's very little discussion of transference. And his answer is, I only found in one place, but it's very explicit and very consistent with this, because if you're a pane of glass, there's nothing. You can't transfer onto a pane of glass. You can transfer onto a mirror or a blank screen, but you see through a pane of glass, don't you? So that you're not likely to, it's not an object on which you could fix the active components of transference mind. Well, it's obviously not one or the other, and the finest empathist is no more than a very murky pane of glass, no doubt. So that one isn't one or the other. But that image, and in all the psychiatric schools, this either the glass or the mirror or the screen comes up again and again to describe the functions of the different school methods. But I think that's one of the most interesting metaphors, if you like, or descriptions of empathic work. As you become nothing in a sense, but a pane of glass through which the other is seen. And then just connect that with the dictionary definition of empathy, which is the projection of your own mind into the mind or consciousness of the other. And you have to do that through this window, so to speak, on the other. Another well-known account of the fundamental rule in existential work is attributed, I understand falsely, Al Margulies tells me, to Rollo May. That is the idea of disciplined naivete. Disciplined naivete. Interesting, paradoxical phrase. And there are, as I say, there are still other phrases by which this particular approach to the patient has been characterized. Well, now this talk, which I seem to be slow in getting around to, is about the second part of what I conceive of as the development of empathic method. That is concerns the grammar of the school, the grammar of empathy. And we'll start to talk this afternoon about the different forms of empathic speech, as I conceive it. But before I do that, let me remind you of the grammar of the other schools. The typical grammar of objective descriptive work is interrogative and imperative. That is, physicians particularly learn to ask questions and give orders. And that's the form of their speech. That's one of the reasons, as I like to say, that they're on the whole rather poor social companions, because questioning and ordering people are not the stuff of social life, are they? They're very useful in investigations, the military, situations of that kind, but they're not really. They're really a kind of a bore in the ordinary intercourse, whatever kind of human life. And but those are the things that you learn to do as a physician. And of course, the physician is licensed, both actually and figuratively, to ask about anything. To ask about anything. So that not only is he taught to ask, but he's permitted to ask. He has both authority and responsibility, you might say, in that instance. And this capacity to ask questions which would absolutely be forbidden under any circumstance is a feature of the medical encounter. So interrogatives and imperatives are the grammatical forms of medical discussion. Now, it's interesting that the fundamental rule of analysis is also, curiously enough, an imperative, isn't it? In that light, it seems to me, it connects itself to the medical origins of psychoanalysis. And that Freud was a physician, he was a neurologist, he was an investigator, and I don't think it's any surprise, therefore, that the fundamental rule of analysis should be this subtle command, say whatever comes to mind. And the whole work goes, if you've been in analysis or you've done analysis, you know that the whole work goes forward under this kind of subtle command. And if you haven't done analysis and you've instead done free associative work, you can experience to a slighter degree, but still a very present degree, this fact of a subtle command. Because as you wait there for the patient's associations, you can feel yourself putting a kind of suction pressure, a kind of mental plaster on the patient, to draw out, so to speak, this hidden material. And it's a favorite subject of mine is the various forms of silence in psychotherapeutic work. Well, this is the silence of the order, the silence of the say more, and announces its imperative, not imperative, at least its command structure, you might say. Analysis, however, of course, is most famous for a grammar without grammar. That is the grammar of silence. And the whole business that if the doctor were to say nothing, the analyst were to say nothing, the patient might say more. Is, of course, a remarkable discovery. It could only be a remarkable discovery to people who did as much ordering and questioning as physicians. Everybody else knew that, of course. But it certainly was a revolution, in part because of the canon of medical talk, of interrogation and ordering. But it was, in fact, a truth. The physician would shut up. Many of the patients would say much more. However, this, of course, was not the sole structure of analytic speech. There's the whole business of interpretation as a final form of analytic speech, and we'll get around to that eventually. I'm not going to talk about that very much today. But then there are other devices that are also added to silence in order to produce the flow. And the most common one that's used is the repetition of a phrase, with the idea of underlining that in the hope that it would help to pull out a little more the so-called red thread of the unconscious. And those of you who have done free associative work extensively know that you find yourself kind of urging some lines of thought along, repeating some phrases, underlining others, offering a kind of an encouraging background of expostulation, in order to move along the flow of associations. Well, I'm going to talk much more later. Under the heading of projective and counterprojective speech about the grammatical structure of interpersonal work. But let me begin to move into the grammatical structure of existential work. I think that it helps us to identify this if we realize that the pronouns are different in the schools. For example, the pronouns of interrogation and ordering are I, you. What do you think? Or where do you hurt? Or I tell you to take your pill. It's an I, you. In other words, the subject-object differentiation is highly developed in medical work. And that's in keeping with the fact that I look at you. You are an object of my objective vision, etc. And I, you also specify that. Analysis, this is not so evident. For example, analytic interpretations very frequently make use of the first person plural, we, in which the alliance is fostered as the two rational egos engage in an observation of the irrational split part of the patient's mental life. The first person plural is a common pronoun in some analytic work. Now, one of the things that really struck me as a very interesting thing was it seems to me that, at least in English, the form of empathic statements tends to use the third person impersonal singular, it. For example, if you say, it must be awful, that's an empathic statement. It must be awful. And it doesn't say you feel awful. That identifies you as the holder of a feeling and separates me from you. But it must be awful is essentially sharing a state of mind, i.e. it would be awful for anyone. So the third person singular impersonal pronoun is one guide to the nature of an empathic utterance. And even when you use a form of speech like you must feel awful, in which you do use a personal pronoun, the you must is equivalent to it, because it says anyone would feel. Anyone would feel awful under those circumstances. And just as I said, I'm going to talk much more about interpersonal speech later, but there, the third person, personal, singular, or plural, is the form of the speech. I.e., you say, mother must have been a bitch. That she must have been a bitch. or she was a bitch. In other words, you make statements about people in the patient's life. And those have the form of using the third person singular or the third person plural personal pronouns, he, she, rather than it. So I would try to persuade you that the grammar of the schools has a highly specific pronominal feature, and that those pronouns in part are selected on the basis of the extent to which they encourage subject-object differentiation or de-differentiation, that is, merging with the other through the sharing of a state of mind, as in empathic speech. Now, the simplest form of empathic speech are what I call exclamations. And indeed, exclamations are one means by which you determine, one of the means by which you determine whether you're actually with someone or not. And you can demonstrate this to yourself by remembering what kind of utterances spontaneously occurred to you when you were sharing an experience with a friend. And if you go back over those experiences, I think you'll find out that your speech very often became simply exclamatory. That is, you said, how awful, or oh God, great. But you tended to use accentuated adjectives or nouns which were essentially statements of the shared feeling that you had with the person. And I'm sure some of you have heard me say ad nauseum that this first came to me when I was reading my children Sherlock Holmes and realized that Holmes was this incredibly paranoid and schizoid character. Holmes could be disinhibited by the physician Watson's speech, and it was not his questions or his interrogations. Typically those would be a physician, perhaps especially an English physician, but instead it was the ejaculatory or exclamatory component in Watson's speech, the by Jove, or good God, and the rest of it, which were features of his responses to the horror tales that Holmes, he could induce Holmes to elaborate. And that seems to me the first and most primitive form of empathic speech. Now, of course, we don't have to talk about empathic speech, and there are people, and we know them very well, who are able to be empathic, i.e. to convey empathy, to be present in the other, without saying a damn thing. And that their simple expressions is enough to place them with the other person. And then there are others who don't need to make a lot of speeches or comments or sentences or even exclamations, but they may do so by means of noises. And I've noticed sometimes in the tape recordings of interviews with empathic therapists that you'll very often hear in the background certain kinds of groans and joyful noises that more or less punctuate the affective phase through which the patient is going. One of the examples of this, which is very, very dear to my heart, is that I noticed that I sometimes found myself moaning when people were crying and I was talking to, and it seemed to be very interesting that in Darwin's book on the expression of emotions in man and animals, he remarks that the word cry, this is Darwin now, the word cry means both to moan and to lacrimate. And he says this is true of a number of languages, and it's also characteristic that grief, according to Darwin, is expressed in animals by both lacrimation and moaning. So I thought to myself, well, in my moaning, when the other person is crying, I'm, so to speak, completing the expressive nature of grief. And there's lots of very interesting things in that book about the way, the physiology, or the physiological expression of emotions, and it's another one that I thought was of great interest was that Darwin, I forget just how it goes, but Darwin contrasts the breathing pattern in laughter and the breathing pattern in sadness or pain. And in one case there's a long expiration and a short inspiration, and the other is reversed, so that they're physiologically opposite of each other. And I was interested in that, not because of maybe that one would take that for granted, but I noticed that, as I'm sure we all have, that sometimes when when one is very uncomfortable in the presence of grief, one will laugh, almost as if one's distancing oneself from that particular, that antipathic state by means of doing the very opposite physiologically of what one would do if one shared that particular feeling, and shared literally in the physiological sense the pattern of respirations that would be characteristic of one or the other. Well, as I say, there's a lot of things in Darwin that are interesting to, in terms of the identification of emotions and seeing and measuring the extent to which your own affective or noise response to the patient corresponds to the affective state of the patient. Now, the whole subject of clinical noises is a fascinating one. It's like the question of clinical silence, the different forms of clinical sounds. But the noises are a wonderful subject for somebody to write a book about, or someone. Maybe they've already written it. And I sometimes say you can tell where someone trained by the kind of noises that they make spontaneously. Around here, for example, it used to be a joke that you could always tell someone was trained as a psycho because they made a slight rising noise at the end of a statement. Sort of like French n'est-ce pas. Is it not so? And I thought about that for a long time. I realized, well, that makes a lot of sense. Uneasy. And the reason that was common was that was very characteristic of the man who sat in this seat, right, not in this chair, but in this place, from 1946 to about 1964. It was my predecessor in this room, Ives Hendrick, who used to use that rising expression at the end of statements, and I'll explain why I use it. And he was a very influential teacher in Boston. One of his students was Elvin Semrad, and it spread like wildfire through our somewhat stereotypic community. And but notice what a beautiful thing that is, that noise, because a rising noise at the end of a statement half turns it into a question. Now, see how that plays right into what I'm trying to make a case for. See, a question is no good. It's too direct. It's too prying. You can't do it. A statement, however, might be left too much alone, so you half turn it into a question. So it's a little bit prying, but not very prying. So you find a form of utterance that lies in between a statement and a question, which allows you to make a less forceful interrogation, you might say. And that psycho noise, as it used to be called, that rising noise into the sentence is a beautiful instrument for falling between the interrogative school and something a little bit less directive. Mm-hmm. There's a great passage, one of my favorite passages in all psychiatric literature in Sullivan's The Psychiatric Interview, in which he talks about noises which should precede changing the subject. Well, you know that great passage. He describes them as accented noises, medium and unaccented noises. And he makes the wonderful observation that if you will make a noise sort of unfamiliar, he suggests a noise like a ball bearing with some sand in it. I don't know what the hell that was, how you do that, but that's what he suggests. If you make that noise rather sort of, if you want to, this is when you want to change the subject. You're bored with what is going on, or you think the subject is leading into dangerous territory. You want to change the subject. If you make a noise like a ball bearing with some sand in it, the patient will sort of half hear it, not hear it, but they'll know that this, as Sullivan says, the temperature in the room has changed, and they will then almost invariably forget what they're talking about. Now, that means that they're probably bored with what they're saying also, and they're sort of obsessing about it. But they'll forget what they were talking about. They'll have a little retrograde amnesia after the noise, and then you can very easily introduce a new subject without them feeling you've interrupted them, because they've forgotten what they were talking about. You see the technical point there. If you say, stop, I'm sick and tired of this, let's discuss B, right? You've got a fight in your hands half the time. On the other hand, if you make some noise and they wonder and forget what they were talking about, and then you mention B, the whole thing goes along very much more easily. Well, do look that thing up for yourself. And he's got several examples of wonderful ways in which you sort of keep the interview moving without making a federal case about every damn thing you do, which is what we suffer too much from. But I like to think of the work as being, as you know, as being more closer to music than to sort of rational speech or mathematics. and that you should be able to think about your interventions in terms of sounding a certain tone or note which directs things or reveals things. And I hope that musical analogy does not seem unscientific or anything awful like that, because in fact, because music is the way in which we most deeply reach each other in a certain sense. And if you're like me and you find that when you're listening to Leontine Price, you feel like that some clever neurophysiologist has connected your entire spinal apparatus to this woman's vocal cords so she can just run up and down your back in what is really an autonomic mastery of you, then you know how direct music, of course, can be. And I've quoted already my favorite line from Wittgenstein, which is that the word must be like a note sounded on the keyboard of the imagination, which, of course, is making the same point over there. So I don't think we should sell short the various musical noises, if you like, or analogies to musical expression that might allow us to gain some access to the person's deeper mental processing.